Good evening, everyone. I am really happy to be here and like to say congratulations to Zoe for her wonderful book. And it's such a pleasure to read with Angie, who's a poet I admire tremendously. I like to read on the short side, so I'm going to keep it short and sweet, but I'd also like to thank McNally Jackson for hosting us and for all of you for having time in your lives during these complicated, heavy days for poetry. Well, long live poetry and long live ourselves, or the best of ourselves anyway. So I'm going to start with a poem called History. History. It's late. History promises you a kiss when she comes to bed. So you say goodnight. You're tired and can't keep your eyes open. So you called it surprisingly early. She, like every night this summer, stays up to watch her shows. Later, she woke you, accidentally, with a light you thought was dawn, but was just the white haze of her cell. You stayed half awake in the lit darkness, thinking she owed you something, a mere kiss. Waiting, one eye half open, like the flesh in a shell sensing a swimmer pass by. The light turned off, as if it never happened. And nothing came to you, because you were owed absolutely nothing. Not even the growing indifference in her voice. Violins. He never saw a violin, but he saw a lifetime of violence. This is not to presume that if he had simply seen a violin, there would have been less violence, or that living among violins, as though they were boulangeries or toppling stacks of other glazed goods like young adult fiction, would have made the violence less crack and more cocaine. Less, of course, and more, why, God, oh why? More of one thing doesn't rhyme with one thing. A swill of stars doesn't rhyme with star. A posse of poets doesn't rhyme with poet. We are all in prison. This is the brutal lesson of the 21st century, swilled like a sour stone through the vein of the beast who watches you while you eat. Our eternal host, the chummed fiddler, the better tomorrow, 2016. Mortality Ode. As Zoe and Angie will attest to, poems should be written in sublime moments at sublime sights, mountain peaks, near lakes. This one was written inside of a cell phone store, which is also a sublime place, right? Mortality Ode. Waiting in the cellular store like waiting for bread. We see two NYC police cars pull up casually, one behind the other. Two officers enter, two wait outside. One struts up and stops a few feet from the counter and leans forward, like a dark blue crane. The person at the front of the line, over whose shoulder he makes concrete the coarse abstraction of his presence, doesn't turn. The woman behind the counter asks the officer for his name, which begins with officer. She tells him he's now in the system. She'll call him when it's his turn to make himself comfortable. The other officers come in then. They begin fidgeting with the phones on display and talk about those things they feel they can talk about, suddenly public in their public service, hemmed in with the rest of us cut off from communication, worldless. I have no idea how much time has passed now. I don't have my phone. Well over an hour, I feel a creeping hunger. Anyway, one of them breaks away from the conversation for another compulsory round of seeming like he has something to do. Grim-waisted, he dawdles past the digital tablets and begins testing the weight of oversized smartphones and smartphones small enough to fit in a watch. His right hand hip high and resting on the pimpled, black, blunt end of his piece as he walks, like all of them, unbalanced but propped up by strange gravity, now visible. A monochrome, unearned elegance. He orbits us, curious for a moment about his future, about what will be in his hand when it's not reaching into a holster, when he checks the weather and wonders what in the world to wear. I watch him pass by the inventory on display twice before he slowly strides over to the glass window in the back corner of the store, where a solitary engineer tinkers with unresponsive hardware clinging to life. He leans forward the way his partner did, as though he is learning something or remembering something or being someone, learning something or remembering something. His right hand lifting from the dead metal and meeting his left on the blue ledge of the swing door shut tight just below the window, locking his fingers together, arms akimbo, his badge now caught on the edge like a wedge, and then, just as it looked like his nose might touch the glass, the guy who's been helping me, who disappeared into those mysteries of the back, the shelves of stock, bouquets of crumpled stuff, the Shangri-La of the staff John, suddenly emerges from an unseen door and asks the officer if he can pass. Sure, the officer says, and the brother makes a beeline to me. My phone is finally ready. It took a while to transfer all the content to the upgrade, lots of data, but I'm all set now, he says. I turn the phone on. The black screen ignites, singing a single held passion note, a pretense of life, then stops, revealing my home screen. Everything I had before looks up at me now from the sleek mirage of short-lived newness, short-lived lightness. But it's pretty though. True. Thanks. The officers are reunited now, huddled like gum, close-knit but silent, their wall mended. I open my phone's camera to sneak a picture of them, because it's 4 cops in a cell phone store. I lift my phone nowhere near their direction, as though I'm simply testing its weight, while straining subtly to center them in the aim. The blurs flame, then suddenly flare and come into focus when the guy who's been helping me, without looking up from his monitor, his hand still resting on his keyboard, like hands holding the end of a net, asks me, his voice quick as a chimera, if I think I'll want protection for that. Because you never know. You never, ever know. This poem is called The Question. This goes out to all of you who've been so kind enough to join us and celebrate Zoe's debut. The question. When did you know you wanted to become a poet? No one believes this question. No one listens for the answer. It's one of those habits of people forced to live together on a spinning rock. The pale blue dot a wince in the wide attention the dying light seeks out from ice giants dull and firm in the dark. Under polite lights, midst rows and rows of people who ask when and why about poetry. Of she who forgets to ask something that was, I realized later, part of the poem. the part where it all comes together, and having come together, finally sings. Tradition and the individual talent. Well, I know this poem by heart. I don't really have to look for it, do I? Tradition and the individual talent. I wandered through each chartered street till I was shot by the police. I'm just going to read two more poems. The first one is the last one from Living Weapon. It's called Even Homer Nods. Even Homer Nods. You can be a mother who knows a God, and you can ask him for magic armor, a shield the width of Saturn's widest rings, some helmet in the new or ancient style. Fill your arms with defenses for your child. Take the peacock feather you've been offered and plant it in that helmet's crown, or keep it for yourself to use as a pen. Note, this was the only option you were offered, stylist or witness, witness with stylus, so that you'd circle down the drain with death, mourning in either silence or sound bites, surrounded by silence and sound bites. Life like this, having been polished to shine in the normal ways things shine these days. A dull lull, the type of insufficient glare we used to call out on sight as useless glow, but now in new darkness we feel a need for a consolation of presence. As when my mother passed me the soft shield, the breastplate like rice paper, the helmet bright as pyrite can be. We already knew that this was part of the old cycle, that I would die soon without a weapon, and she'd live on. And we do this again and again and again, without ever knowing we were the weapons ourselves, stronger than steel, story, and hydrogen. Here in America, where we wonder still, after everything that's happened, why anyone bothers to read the classics. And one final short poem that I wrote recently and appears in an online journal called The Night Heron Barks, which you can feel free to check out. It's called Screens. Screens. George Floyd's face floats slightly out of focus, in the same way a fire always does, because there is no beginning or end when you look at either. Only the heat. Remember the heat, how it burns the back of the throat as night screams his name through the flames.
Thank you, Rowan. It was beautiful. Up next, we have Angie Malenko. Angie is the author of 5 books of poetry: Distant Mandate, Marvelous Things Overheard, which was selected by both the New Yorker and the Boston Globe as a best book of 2013, Shoulder Season, a finalist for the William Carlos Williams Award, Starred Wire, which was a National Poetry Series winner in 2004 and a finalist for the James Laughlin Award, and Matinees. She was a Guggenheim Fellow in 2014. She was poetry editor for The Nation from 2013 to 2016 and her criticism appears regularly in the London Review of Books and New York Review of Books. Thank you, Angie.
Am I unmuted?
You're good.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks for that great introduction. I'm honored to be here with Zoe and Rowan to help launch this outstanding first book, Mezzanine. I'll be reading 4 new or newish poems, and I'll begin with a poem called Amour, which refers to the Renaissance poet Thomas Wyatt's poem, My Lute Awake, but mostly it features the troubadour poet William IX, Duke of Aquitaine, or the Count of Poitou, and his poem, I'll Write a Poem About Nothing, which also contains the line, I'll write it sleeping on my horse. It was the troubadours who popularized rhyme in European poetry, deriving it from Moorish or Persian influences. Amour. Barrel bombs, chlorine gas, tomahawks. The crowd balks at the little lute sleeping through the news. What was of use is shipwrecked on seashores like the Mustang, and who once sang of small swords and chafrons is at liberty to sing about anything. Tourists behold the horses, left to their own devices on island paradises accessible by ferry or intracoastal bridge. They've lost prestige, if none of their grand manner. It is a pity that their utility is far outstripped by the cost of their upkeep. Quote, I wrote this asleep, riding on my horse, unquote. He didn't praise this muse, as did Imru al-Quz, his camel, but growing up at court, heard songs from captured Moorish women. Come to think of it, the intricate cricket cages on display in the University Museum recalled me to them. Also, this Count of Poitou brought west, after being a guest at the learned Byzantine courts at Antioch, a cultivated stock of rhymes, and possibly introduced the rose, born on those roots well worn by the Crusaders and babied on a shaking bed for 1,000 miles. But then again, a painting from Poussin, sent on horseback to Richelieu somewhere, vanished into air. Awake, my lute, let's sing a song of nothing. About suffering, they were never wrong. Opposition forces, rhymes and roses. This next poem is in the lighthearted spirit of the troubadours. You can tell it's very new because it's about masks and birds and poets' masks. And it's about one of my favorite literary heroines who flouts her social isolation with flamboyance. It's called Cordon Sanitaire. Hester Prynne was a great Venetian, stitching those Rococo masks of hers in, what was it, Salem, conquered? Arduously embroidering toward her eventual return to the fold. Every stitch a step, every step foretold by a design still hidden in things, or should we say masqueradings, as cardinals join the sewing circle, them bluebirds with their creamsicle bibs. Even the plain homespun wren and sparrow have masks they warn me to put on my own. I try on theirs, they try on mine, each embroiders the air with its signature, shoots the breeze, as Hester sews another with intricacies, like the rubrics of illuminated manuscripts, bindweed coiling through hearsay and tips, dirt and buzz. The bluebirds on the fence look for words, worms, to mince. One mask is a gingham and floral rigmarole, another denim, another a kind of origami of Venetian paper, such as Hester Prynne would have studied for its pattern. I catch a glimpse of the bird within a bird that, seen from below, is white embroidered on its shadow self, its own dark side, or like its groom self, basted to its bride. The cardinal's note pierces the fanfare. He pauses in the leafage before making a pair with an unassuming female. Hester doesn't make like a camouflaging nester. She's flamboyant, Xing out the rules. Quote, on a field sable, the letter A, gules, unquote, embroidering, as if thereby remaking rule as sumptuous lie. I sit a silhouette behind the porch screen, trapped, while the trapezoids of green, deepening with shade, cannot withhold sparrows returning to the fold. Now human speech is overdubbed by winged droplets of sky subdued into bluebirds. Now instead of blithe, they're anxious, almost out of breath. Night is falling, forced by the pinprick abysses in our threadbare communal fabric to wait for immunity at needlepoint. We sit behind screens or pay the penalty. Hester Prynne embroiders her mask while singers with their jeweled flask bodies make pass after pass across the borders, peeping back at us back porch birders. This cordon sanitaire between us is determined less by microbes than discourse. Masked, every cardinal's a wild card as a bluebird falls for its own reflection in the glass. My third poem takes its title from an unfinished or unrealized artwork that the sculptor Rodin modeled after Dante's Inferno. It's called The Gates of Hell, and it assembles characters like Paolo and Francesca in a set piece called Fugit Amor, Fleeing Love, as well as allegorical figures like Fallen Caryatid and most famously of all the lovers in The Kiss. It takes place at an airport. The Gates of Hell. He didn't mean these kinds of gates, but here we are, or I mean I. On these darkest days of the year, the sun shows how it accommodates our needs and turns itself on high. Show me, sun, what I am doing here. I've been thinking for some time about Fallen Caryatid shouldering her capital. Actually, there were two. The other bore an urn. They made a rhyme. So did Fugit Amor, the enduring nature of attraction to undo. The traveling show, arrayed in a gallery in Savannah, was a gift. Now at the gates of an airport, another Christmas traveler laden with all that should uplift. I'm trying to be a good sport on my first holiday without my kids. The garbage trucks resume their rounds on roads cellophaned with ice, masticating packaging like chrysalids, summarily shaken for sounds or weighed in the hand for the size of the happiness underneath. I steer my thoughts back to the show of misery beyond measurement between gates which bequeath images of angel wings working to slow a fall, not maneuver an ascent. The sun that cufflinks a hill's white sleeve, the plane that bootstraps us to the sky, neither is adequate to the human need individual to each of us here who leave someone else behind to cry, cued with scarcely a line to read. He removed the kiss from the ensemble, surmising correctly that naked bliss was out of place at the gates of hell. If it is bliss that makes us tremble, if it is not also its own abyss between two gates at a terminal. And my last poem is called The Sirens Have Stopped Singing and takes its epigraph from Kafka. Now the sirens have a weapon that is still more terrible than their singing, which is to say their silence. I stepped in out of the cold at loose ends on a day the temps had fallen below a threshold I could stand or even walk in, as ice intends us more or less to glide when hazarding snowflake fairyland. Who knew I was gliding toward the heaven of disused instruments? Flutes and clarinets in glass cases, a whole floor of harpsichord and piano with open vents to steal guts, those ivory grimaces, that jumble of multiple legs. It might have been a rustled herd sending up a silent wail. Displays of hand-carved mutes, tuning pegs and chin rests conferred dignity to accoutrements. The days of accoutrements are all but over. And then there was the odd thing any craftsman would redact, an open work bell that couldn't cover the bare requirements for a ring, a woodwind like a digestive tract. Prettiest of all were the viol, lute, and harp, each fashioned with a head, female, coiffured in wood and ivory, leaning into negotiations so acute, I drew close to hear what was being said, from which there will be no recovery.
Thank you, Angie. That was also beautiful. And our guest of honor tonight is Zoë Hitzig. She is a poet and PhD candidate in economics at Harvard University, and her poetry has appeared in The New Yorker, the London Review of Books, the New York Review of Books, New Statesman, Boston Review, Poetry, and elsewhere. Her writing about poetry has appeared in Bomb and Prac Crit. Mezzanine is her first book, and it came out yesterday. About Mezzanine, the wonderful poet Timothy Donnelly wrote, "Named for the floor between floors and a kind of amphibious financing, Zoe Hitzig's exquisitely engineered Mezzanine lands the reader in a nether place of talking commodities, misplaced agency, category mistakes, and radical dysphoria. As intricately woven as it is scrupulously observed and considered, if this unwell trellis work of anomie and economics sounds strangely familiar, that's because we live here, siloed on digital platforms where denial is easy, where fabricated cricket song takes the place of crickets, and self-knowledge has been obviated by human subject research. Into these dire circumstances, Hitzig dives headfirst, feverish, an investigator who grapples with reality by recasting it from the inside out. In other words, she is a poet, and an extraordinary one at that, one whose response to our communal plight is charged with an intensity that at times recalls Eliot in its elegant, extra-personal despair, but here and there, and just in time, a fleck of good cheer or unexpected hopefulness reminds us of what there is to love in the human and what it feels like to feel like it's still too soon to give up. And with that, I will pass things off to Zoe.
Thank you so much, John. And thank you, Angie and Rowan, for reading and joining me to help launch this book into the world. It's really an honor to be able to read with two of my favorite poets, though I am also realizing that it was a somewhat dubious decision because now I just want to listen to them read and get to hear. It's such a privilege to read their new work and hear about it in this form. But I guess it's my turn now. So thank you all for coming. I know it's a really difficult time. We are in dire circumstances. And in some ways, I think this book, Mezzanine, is well suited to the moment, just in that the Mezzanine, the thing that links these poems together is that they're spoken from a world in transition. They're spoken from this floor between floors. And I'm grateful that all of you were willing to come listen to some poems from it. So I'll just read a few and then we'll move on to a conversation. I'll start with the first poem in the book. Can everyone hear me okay? I guess no one could respond really. Can you hear me in the back? Okay. The first poem is called I Looked on My Right Hand and Beheld. A hand made out of all that it touched. Fingers of syringes packed with soiled polyester blankets. Nails cut from a plastic bottle cap. Knuckles shaped by rinds of other knuckles and details layered in delicate ash. Ruddy, colorful, clothed. But the left, flesh and gray, poured like the concrete surrounding it and sanded at the edges, careful as geometry allows, with dried skin creeping through contours. Naked hands, beating knuckles on the ground, wondering, will it crack the concrete? Will it crumble under opposing forces? Material, economy, as simple as concrete is simple, simple to explain, but difficult to understand without explanation. As plates in our deep crust skid past one another, one might wonder who thinks to pour a building of mostly liquid. Such is the logic of conviction, we are told, before the terms are defined. Dysfunction of episodic memory. Episode of memory of dysfunction. Hands that are not our hands. And so convinced are we of our own demise, we devise it. The next one that I'm going to read is a little bit, shall we say, on the nose for the moment. It's called How We Programmed the Apocalypse. And this is one of many poems in this book that sort of has what I would call the succession problem, like the TV show, in that it has no likable characters. How We Programmed the Apocalypse. Remember the sonic attack? Kind of like that. Simulate the sounds of crickets, then decimate the crickets. Sounds of a lover who can see in 16 colors. Sound of undread heretofore heard only by the dead. Soon the people hear our sound. Each wants her own private symphony. In a long queue, they gradually accrue. From a distance, they seem to stretch continuous, smoothly defined as a smile line. But up close, one sees discontinuities, upraised fists, cupping palms, trading sundries, shouldering past sisters and Sundays, casting around for ways to afford the sound. Neighbor came to mean she who queued in my vicinity. As the queue shortened, everyone could afford it. Then everyone was plural. Data. Everything served and being served on metal servers. It was never our intent to punctuate the sentences of others. But now it's late, too late to unstate our importance. And besides, the crickets died for this. Pulses quicken, slipping across our screens. We play the quieting machines. We pity the soon unseen. A thought arrives. Ask forgiveness instead. No. Everyone we pity dies. The rest rust in line. Yeah, nothing likable there. The next one I will read is one of a few poems in this book that have the same title or variations on the same title. the core of the title is Trial for the New Aubade. And for those who don't know, an aubade is the song that a lover sings to a departed lover at dawn. So I guess the key piece, the defining piece of an aubade, and maybe someone else here knows better, but the defining piece is that this is a song sung at dawn, often to a departed lover. First trial for the new aubade. Does the season match the bird song? Did I hear the bird song over the white noise machine? Who brought the white noise machine here? Was it the other, heaving next to me under a shroud? For how many seasons has she been sleeping here next to me? Was there a logic of want to begin with? In a seaside town or a dark box rattling underground? Did she come through a revolving door like the termite winding up through the drain of my sink basin? Was there a seasonal contract or perpetual exchange? Who installed the sour drain in my middle? Is it time to adjust my angles? For whom? Whom today? Tomorrow? What is history cloaking as burlap wraps around wet figs? Is there a logic of want? When will my season match my song? I'm just going to do two more. The next one belongs to a series in the book that deals with wrongful convictions. So sort of probing why wrongful convictions tend to happen and how people end up getting exonerated. There are about 6 or 7 books in the poems in the book that deal with different cases, real cases. This one is called Objectivity as Blanket. Nor the police, hyenas on hearing 5 confessions, 4 false and 1 too irresistible. Nor the mental health elephant, tusked by the state. Nor the common sense stork, twisting at the prosecutor's feet. Nor the one juror, uneasy facing 11 pale sheep that bay all day, all night for conviction. Nor the governor, sir. Nor the common sense stork, now in a knot. Nor the shots, nor the claws unbending, nor the claws bending. Nor, seeing his fitful approach, did one turn back to flip the window latch for the life form nearly breaking himself on glass. Nor the next governor, nor the state, carriage horses trotting ever steady, blinders acute to the eye. Nor the widower, how could he? Puma in pull focus. Nor the defense counsel, not for lack of it. Nor the stork, is she breathing? Is there such a thing as breathing here, and does it mean? The polyester, the royal blue, the blanket on the bed of the mother of 2. The last one, the one that I'll end with, well, I should say before I read the last poem here, and we'll have a bit of a discussion, but I just want to say thank you to everyone who helped me make this book, and thank you to McNally Jackson as well for hosting this event. McNally has been one of my favorite bookstores for my whole life, and I'm so grateful to be hosted by them. And thank you to the whole team at Echo that believed in this book and made a real dream come true for me, especially Dan Halpern and Gabriella Dube and Martin Wilson, who helped on publicity. I don't know if they're here because screens don't quite show me everyone, but Thank you to all of you, and thank you to my family and friends who supported me along the way. And thank you to friends who jumped in and edited pieces of this. Thank you to my roommate who set up the lighting for this event, and a friend, Mark, I don't know if he's here, who helped me with my contract for the book deal. Those are a bunch of thank yous. Now I'll read one last poem that's very weird, and if it isn't clear already from the introduction that John read, and from the poems I've read so far, this is quite a strange book, and a lot of strange objects speak and are given voice. And I think this is probably one of the strangest. This poem is spoken from a piece of money, and it's an ancient, not ancient, but very old piece of money on the island of Yap in Micronesia. Since about 100 CE, the Yapese have been using large immovable stones with holes in the center as currency, and they're quarried from a nearby island. And what's very interesting about this monetary system is that these stones don't really change hands, because that would be impractical. They're just very big. And in fact, their physical instantiations matter so little that one time the Yapese went on a trip to go quarry some new stones, and one of the very largest stones that they had ever quarried before was lost at sea. But it didn't really matter, because it was already sort of in circulation. So that very large stone at the bottom of the sea remained in the monetary system. And of course, it makes perfect sense for that stone to speak in my new book. I am the stone lost at sea. There is a hole at my center. A stone lodged in the fold of the sea. I am still dense with value. Why am I missing a center? What is arrogant? Simply know I am smoother and bigger than the Blarney stone. Someone is proud to call me his. I am the stone lost at sea. There is a hole at my center. It takes a special power to remain here and belong to a different man every so often, to change hands. I am still dense with value. Why am I missing the center? The hands hold me as the grains of sand that outline the stone of Gibraltar. Only the sea is my owning, mine. I am the stone lost at sea. The whole is my center. Without me, the richest man would not be rich. Several others would be evicted. That is how money works. I am still dense with value, right where I'm missing a center. So say I cannot reproduce, but am worth more in baskets than I was quarried for. Am the stone lost at sea. There is a hole, my center. I am still. I am the missing. Thank you, everyone. And thanks again for being here. And I hope you'll enjoy Mezzanine. I guess we're moving on to questions now.
We do have a question in the chat from Kenta, who says, congratulations from Japan. In the current world, flooded with mass media, amplified by technology, there are countless ways in which letters, words, and sentences exist, form, and impact us. Fiction books, nonfiction books, articles, screenplays, tweets, Facebook posts, memes, the list goes on, all different in weight, rhythm, scale, and the way they're consumed. I intuitively feel that poetry is special among all of these mediums, but I can't personally articulate why. In this time and world, what do you think is the unique power and position that poetry embodies?
I'm supposed to answer that? I think that I think that poetry opens a space to dwell. And what I mean by that is that so much of the flood that we get, the inundation of information that we experience on a daily basis, is a little bit more didactic. It's telling us what to think in some way. I certainly feel that way with advertising and social media and the news. It comes at you and tells you a way of thinking. And to me, poetry is something that you step into rather than something that comes at you and hits you. And so when you get to step in, you get to sort of build your own space and your own relationship to verse, and I think that can often lead to a deeper kind of reflection, and I think that's why poetry hasn't gone away. It's one of the oldest art forms in some way. And I don't know if this exactly answers your question, but I think that's the key distinction to me, is that a poem opens a space to step into rather than sort of throwing something at you for you to digest. But I wonder if Rowan and Angie have any thoughts on it. I'm trying to deflect.
Thanks, Zoe.
Should I give it a shot?
Sure.
Well, this made me think of something that I read in Rowan's, a poem of Rowan's that he didn't read tonight. Let's see, it's in the Peacock. So, when Rowan has the lines, that poetry finally arriving at the listener who makes sense of it sooner or later. It's a kind of lighthearted translation of Paul Valéry's statement that a poem is that prolonged hesitation between sound and meaning. So if you open up this space between the hearing and the understanding, it's a very elastic space. Sometimes the space is very short, but often in poetry, the space is very large. And in that space between hearing and understanding, you learn a lot. You learn patience. You learn to, you learn the value of time in learning something, that things don't just come like that, that you have to create space for things to be absorbed and to come to have meaning over time. Does that make any sort of sense?
It totally does. Thank you.
Am I using your words correctly, Rowan?
No, that's, I'd be hard pressed to find a moment when we kind of like disagree on poetics. But I also think, when you talk about other forms of mass media, there's something about poetry, particularly in terms of a word that Zoe used in her wonderful poems, value, that poetry has a residual value that increases and is not kind of threatened by the loss of a misperception of its immediate value. To put it colloquially, the long game is the only game with poetry, right? So you write a poem with the idea that at some point it finds readers and that they will sustain it. That's why poetry, even though it was oral for millennia, kept on, because it had readers and forms which sustained it. And what happens with whether it's a TV show or song or what have you, I can tell you, oh, the band Can is really great, or there's a black punk band from Detroit from the 70s called Death, and they're really great. And you could get to them now and appreciate them, but they are artists who can't in any way or shape or form really benefit now, aside from the enjoyment of having a listener, to your experience of the art form. But poetry, because even in its moment, there's really no great market for it, that you're not dealing in this lost opportunity of value or of gain. So if anything, the greatest gift that a poem could have, unlike any other form of mass media, is that someone, at some point, it's a message in a bottle, right? And that value will always have tremendous value, not just to the reader, but to culture and to that poet, her or himself.
Thank you, Rowan.
Zoe, I had a question. I'm working with a group that are talking about connections, connecting to yourself, connecting to others, and connecting to the universe. And I'm always interested in where the notion of the idea comes from, where the poetry comes from. Do you believe that you're channeled, that this comes from some other place, and what's the process in you going to the imagery of the poetry that's so incredible that you write?
Thank you so much for that question. That for everyone who doesn't know, this is my Uncle Rupert in Los Angeles. And I think that it's a hard question to answer without sounding kind of Delphic and mystical or something. I think there's a conversation with some outside force when I write. I often have an idea. A poem will start with an image, start with a few lines that I know I want to use in something. And then the process of sort of iterating and getting something on the page feels very much out of body and as if I'm in conversation with some outside force of some kind, if that makes any sense to you at all. But yeah, it's still a mystery to me. I think maybe at some point when I'm a mature poet or something, I'll have a clear idea of how it all comes together. But for me, it's currently just sort of still a mystical experience. And I think that's what I love about it. It comes from outside, and I feel that I'm responding to something and saying something that needs to be said. For example, that How We Programmed the Apocalypse poem. I mean, this is really quite strange. I don't know if I should share this, but the first half of that poem actually was written in a dream, you know. I think a lot of writers and creative people and even academics have this experience where they're like, oh, I proved the theorem in my dream, but I forget what the proof looked like. And you wake up and you're not sure if you actually proved it or your brain just told you that you proved it. And so sometimes it turns out that I can actually write in my dreams.
Coleridge did that with Kubla Khan too, right? Allegedly, but he even put that as an epigraph to the poem itself. Oh, I had the whole poem here and I was dreaming, and then someone knocked on the door and this is all that was left, right?
There's a question in the chat that I wondered about when I first got your email and looked you up, which is, how do you manage to balance this kind of double life between poetry and economics? And maybe what's the connection, if any, between your work and your research?
Yeah, it is a bit of a double life. But it's also not a double life, really. The easy way of putting it is that I do economics in the daytime and I write poetry at night. I've never written a good poem during the day, except when I wake from a dream, So in some ways, the two poles don't really pull time away from each other. And in many ways, the questions that bug me, that I feel compelled to try to answer in economics, are really pretty similar to the questions that bug me that I try to dwell in poetry. And those are always questions about justice and how we should relate to each other and how we should organize ourselves as a society. And both poetry and economics offer different ways of trying to address this deep uncertainty. And the result is very different. In economics, you get theorems and mathematical equations and, statistical findings and statistical expressions, and in poetry you get poems, and the point is very different too. As I said before, the point in poetry is to dwell and to open up a space. The point in academic research is to be didactic and say, make an argument of some kind. And both economics and poetry, at least the kind of economics I do, which is pretty theoretical, they require that you distill some basic insight into a very simple yet rigorous language. Yeah, does that answer the question?
Really interesting. I think we have time for just one more. A good one from Eric. What did you learn about your individual poems when you had to bring them together into a collection and put them into the order you put them into?
That's a great question. The main thing that I learned, and which is reflected in the title, is that the theme that unites these poems is where they're spoken from, and they're spoken from a similar predicament. And that predicament is sort of what the mezzanine represents. And once I could see that all of these poems were sort of leaving a world behind and trying to figure out what's going to come to them in the next world, then I was able to see how to organize the book. And so roughly, I would say the book has 5 sections. And the first section has most of the poems where there are these talking things. An object at a department store speaks, an artifact in a museum speaks, a big building in Singapore speaks, and a scientist speaks, and an auctioneer. And so that first section is sort of all of these voices sort of introducing the mezzanine in a way. And then I grouped the poems sort of thematically. The next section has poems that deal more with the natural world. Then the next one have poems that deal more with the state and the kinds of violence that the state inflicts on its subjects. Then there's a section that's sort of about money, like that last poem that I read. And the final one enters into the body. And what unites all of them is this predicament that they're all spoken from. And that's why I chose a sort of bizarre title, which signifies that space.
The name of the book is Mezzanine. It's published by the very good people at Echo Books. It came out yesterday, and you can get your copy from McNally Jackson. It's right there. It looks so pretty, and it's so good. And Rowan, Angie, Zoe, thank you for letting us host you this way. Thank you for letting us celebrate this book this way. And everybody who tuned in, thank you for your time and attention. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. Thank you to all 3 of you, and congratulations, Zoe.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for coming.
Congratulations, Zoe.
Congratulations, Zoe.
Yeah, feel free to unmute yourself and give her a round of applause. I can hear you in Cambridge.
Hey, Zoe.
Yay, Zoe.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.